On another floor of the hospital, in a waiting room, Ashok hunches over a Bastion globe from a month ago, abandoned on a neighboring chair. He reads about the riots that took place during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and about Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor being sentenced to 2 years in jail for threatening to counsel draft evaders. The Favre Lioba strapped to his wrist is running 6 minutes ahead of the large grey-faced clock on the wall. It is 4:30 in the morning. An hour before, Ashok had been fast asleep at home, Ashima's side of the bed covered with exams he had been grading late at night when the telephone rang. Ashima was fully dilated and being taken to the delivery room. The person on the other end had said. Upon arrival at the hospital he was told that she was pushing, that it could be any minute now, any minute. And yet, it seemed only the other day, one steel-coloured winter mornings, when the windows of the house were being pelted with the hail, that she had spit out her tea, accusing him of mistaking the salt for sugar. To prove himself right, he had taken a sip of the sweet liquid from her cup, but she had insisted on its bitterness and poured it down the sink. That was the first thing that had caused her to suspect, and then the doctor had confirmed it. And then he would wake to the sounds every morning when she went to brush her teeth of her retching. Before he left for the university, he would leave a cup of tea by the bedside, where she lay listless and silent. Often, returning in the evenings, he would find her still lying there, the tea untouched. He now desperately needs a cup of tea for himself, not having managed to make one before leaving the house. But the machine in the corridor dispenses only coffee, tepid at best, in paper cups. He takes off his thick-rimmed glasses, fitted by a Kolkata optometrist, polishes the lenses with the cotton handkerchief he always keeps in his pocket. A for Ashok, embroidered by his mother in light blue thread. His black hair, normally combed back neatly from his forehead, is dishevelled, sections of it on the end. He stands and begins pacing as the other expectant fathers do. So far, the door to the waiting room has opened twice, and a nurse has announced that one of them has a boy or a girl. There are handshakes all round, pats on the back before the father is escorted away. The men wait with cigars, flowers, address books, bottles of champagne. They smoke cigarettes, ashing onto the floor. Ashok is indifferent to such indulgences. He neither smokes nor drinks alcohol of any kind. Ashima is the one who keeps all their addresses, in a small notebook she carries in her purse. It has never occurred to him to buy his wife flowers. He returns to the globe, still pacing as he reads. A slight limp causes Ashok's right foot to drag almost imperceptibly with each step. Since childhood, he has had the habit and the ability to read while walking, holding a book in one hand, on his way to school, from room to room in his parents' 3-story house in Alipur, and up and down the red clay stairs. Nothing roused him. Nothing distracted him. Nothing caused him to stumble. As a teenager, he had gone through all of Dickens. He read newer authors as well. Graham Greene, and Somerset Maugham, all purchased from his favourite stall on College Street with Pujo money. But most of all he loved the Russians. His paternal grandfather, a former professor of European literature at Calcutta University, had read from them aloud in English translations when Ashok was a boy. Each day at tea time, as his brothers and sisters played kabaddi and cricket outside, Ashok would go to his grandfather's room, and for an hour his grandfather would read supine on his bed, his ankles crossed and the book propped open on his chest. Ashok curled at his side. For that hour Ashok was deaf and blind to the world around him. He did not hear his brothers and sisters laughing on the rooftop, or see the tiny, dusty, cluttered room in which his grandfather read. "Read all the Russians and then reread them," his grandfather had said. "They will never fail you." When Ashok's English was good enough, he began to read the books himself. It was while walking on some of the world's noisiest, busiest streets, on Chowringhi and Garihart Road, that he had read pages of the brothers Karamazov and Anna Karenina and Fathers and Sons. Once, a younger cousin who had tried to imitate him had fallen down the red clay staircase in Ashok's house and broken an arm. Ashok's mother was always convinced that her eldest son would be hit by a bus or a tram, his nose deep into War and Peace, that he would be reading a book the moment he died. One day, in the earliest hours of October 20, 1961, this nearly happened. Ashok was 22, a student at BE College. He was travelling on the 83 up Howrah-Ranchi Express to visit his grandparents for the holidays. They had moved from Kolkata to Jamshedpur upon his grandfather's retirement from the university. Ashok had never spent the holidays away from his family, but his grandfather had recently gone blind, and he had requested Ashok's company specifically to read him The Statesman in the morning, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in the afternoon. Ashok accepted the invitation eagerly. He carried 2 suitcases, the first one containing clothes and gifts, the second empty, for it would be on this visit, his grandfather had said, that the books in his glass-fronted case, collected over a lifetime and preserved under lock and key, would be given to Ashok. The books had been promised to Ashok throughout his childhood, and for as long as he could remember, he had coveted them more than anything else in the world. He had already received a few in recent years, given to him on birthdays and other special occasions. But now that the day had come to inherit the rest, a day his grandfather could no longer read the books himself, Ashok was saddened, and as he placed the empty suitcase under his seat, he was disconcerted by its weightlessness, regretful of the circumstances that would cause it, upon his return, to be full. He carried a single volume for the journey, a hardbound collection of short stories by Nikolai Gogol, which his grandfather had given him when he had graduated from class 12. On the title page beneath, his grandfather's signature. Ashok had written his own. Because of Ashok's passion for this particular book, the spine had recently split, threatening to divide the pages into 2 sections. His favorite story in the book was the last, the overcoat, and that was the one Ashok had begun to reread as the train pulled out of Howrah station late in the evening, with a prolonged and deafening shriek away from his parents and his 6 younger brothers and sisters, all of whom had come to see him off and had huddled until the last moment by the window, waving to him from the long, dusky platform. He had read The Overcoat too many times to count, certain sentences and phrases embedded in his memory. Each time he was captivated by the absurd, tragic, yet oddly inspiring story of Akaki Akakievich, the impoverished main character who spends his life meekly copying documents written by others and suffering the ridicule of absolutely everyone. His heart went out to poor Akaki, a humble clerk, just as Ashok's father had been at the start of his career. Each time, reading the account of Akaki's christening, the series of queer names his mother had rejected, Ashok laughed aloud. He shuddered at the description of the tailor Petrovich's big toe, with its deformed nail as thick and hard as the shell of a tortoise. His mouth watered at the cold veal and cream pastries and champagne Akaki consumed the night his previous coat was stolen, in spite of the fact that Ashok had never tasted these things himself. Ashok was always devastated when Akaki was robbed, in a square that looked to him like a dreadful desert, leaving him cold and vulnerable, and Akaki's death some pages later never failed to bring tears to his eyes. In some ways the story made less sense each time he read it. The scenes he pictured so vividly and absorbed so fully, growing more elusive and profound. Just as Akaki's ghost haunted the final pages, so did it haunt a place deep in Ashok's soul, shedding light on all that was irrational, all that was inevitable about the world. Outside, the view turned quickly black, the scattered lights of Howrah giving way to nothing at all. He had a second-class sleeper in the 7th bogie, behind the air-conditioned coach. Because of the season, the train was especially crowded, especially raucous, filled with families on holiday. Small children were wearing their best clothing, the girls with brightly colored ribbons in their hair. Though he had had his dinner before leaving the station, a 4th-layer tiffin carrier packed by his mother sat at his feet, in the event that hunger should attack him in the night. He shared his compartment with 3 others. There was a middle-aged Bihari couple, who, he gathered from overhearing their conversation, had just married off their eldest daughter, and a friendly, pot-bellied, middle-aged Bengali businessman wearing a suit and tie by the name of Ghosh. Ghosh told Ashok that he had recently returned to India after spending 2 years in England on a job voucher, but that he had come back home because his wife was inconsolably miserable abroad. Ghosh spoke reverently of England, the sparkling empty streets, the polished black cars, the rows of gleaming white houses, he said, were like a dream. Trains departed and arrived according to schedule, Ghosh said. No one spat on the sidewalks. It was in a British hospital that his son had been born. Seen much of this world? Ghosh asked Ashok, untying his shoes and settling himself cross-legged on the berth. He pulled a packet of Dunhill cigarettes from his jacket pocket, offering them around the compartment before lighting one for himself. "Once to Delhi," Ashok replied, "and lately once a year to Jamshedpur." Ghosh extended his arm out of the window, flicking the glowing tip of his cigarette into the night. "Not this world," he said, glancing disappointedly about the interior of the train. He tilted his head towards the window. "England, America," he said, as if the nameless villages they passed had been replaced by those countries. "Have you considered going there?" "My professors mention it from time to time, but I have a family," Ashok said. Ghosh frowned. "Already married?" "No, a mother and father and 6 siblings. I am the eldest." "And in a few years you will be married and living in your parents' house," Ghosh speculated. "I suppose." Ghosh shook his head. "You are still young, free," he said, spreading his hands apart for emphasis. "Do yourself a favor, before it's too late, without thinking too much about it first. Pack a pillow and a blanket, and see as much of the world as you can. You will not regret it. One day it will be too late." "My grandfather always says that's what books are for," Ashok said, using the opportunity to open the volume in his hands. "To travel without moving an inch." "To each his own," Ghosh said. He tipped his head politely to one side, letting the last of the cigarette drop from his fingertips. He reached into a bag by his feet and took out his diary, turning to the 20th of October. The page was blank, and on it, with a fountain pen whose cap he ceremoniously unscrewed, he wrote his name and address. He ripped out the page and handed it to Ashok. "If you ever change your mind and need contacts, let me know. I live in Tollygunge, just behind the tram depot." "Thank you," Ashok said, folding up the information and putting it at the back of his book. "How about a game of cards?" Ghosh suggested. He pulled out a well-worn deck from his suit pocket with Big Ben's image on the back, but Ashok politely declined, for he knew no card games, and, besides which, he preferred to read. One by one the passengers brushed their teeth in the vestibule, changed into their pajamas, fastened the curtain around their compartments, and went to sleep. Ghosh offered to take the upper berth, climbing barefoot up the ladder, his suit carefully folded away, so that Ashok had the window to himself. The Bihari couple shared some sweets from a box and drank water from the same cup, without either of them putting their lips to the rim, then settled into their berths as well, switching off the lights and turning their heads to the wall. Only Ashok continued to read, still seated, still dressed. A single small bulb glowed dimly over his head. From time to time he looked through the open window at the inky Bengal night, at the vague shapes of palm trees and the simplest of homes. Carefully he turned the soft yellow pages of his book, a few delicately tunneled by worms. The steam engine puffed reassuringly, powerfully. Deep in his chest he felt the rough jostle of the wheels. Sparks from the smokestack passed by his window. A fine layer of sticky soot dotted one side of his face, his eyelid, his arm, his neck, His grandmother would insist that he scrub himself with a cake of Margot soap as soon as he arrived. Immersed in the sartorial plight of Akaki Akakiyevich, lost in the wide, snow-white, windy avenues of St. Petersburg, unaware that one day he was to dwell in a snowy place himself, Ashok was still reading at 2:30 in the morning. One of the few passengers on the train who was awake when the locomotive engine and 7 bogies derailed from the broad gauge line. The sound was like a bomb exploding. The first 4 bogies capsized into a depression alongside the track. The fifth and sixth, containing the first-class and air-conditioned passengers, telescoped into each other, killing the passengers in their sleep. The seventh, where Ashok was sitting, capsized as well, flung by the speed of the crash farther into the field. The accident occurred 209 kilometers from Kolkata, between the Ghatshila and Dhalbangar stations. The train guard's portable phone would not work. It was only after the guard ran nearly 5 kilometers from the site of the accident to Ghatshila that he was able to transmit the first message for help. Over an hour passed before the rescuers arrived, bearing lanterns and shovels and axes to pry bodies from the cars. Ashok can still remember their shouts, asking if anyone was alive. He remembers trying to shout back unsuccessfully, his mouth emitting nothing but the faintest rasp. He remembers the sound of people half dead around him, moaning and tapping on the walls of the train, whispering hoarsely for help, words that only those who were also trapped and injured could possibly hear. Blood drenched his chest and the right arm of his shirt. He had been thrust part way out the window. He remembers being unable to see anything at all. For the first hours, he thought that perhaps, like his grandfather, whom he was on his way to visit, he had gone blind. He remembers the acrid odor of flames, the buzzing of flies, children crying, the taste of dust and blood on his tongue. They were nowhere, somewhere in a field. Milling about them were villagers, police inspectors, a few doctors. He remembers believing that he was dying, that perhaps he was already dead. He could not feel the lower half of his body, and so was unaware that the mangled limbs of Ghosh were draped over his legs. Eventually he saw the cold, unfriendly blue of earliest morning, the moon and a few stars still lingering in the sky. The pages of his book, which had been tossed from his hand, fluttered in 2 sections, a few feet away from the train. The glare from a search lantern briefly caught the pages, momentarily distracting one of the rescuers. "Nothing here," Ashok heard someone say. "Let's keep going." But the lantern's light lingered just long enough for Ashok to raise his hand, a gesture that he believed would consume the small fragment of life left in him. He was still clutching a single page of the overcoat, crumpled tightly in his fist, and when he raised his hand, the wad of paper dropped from his fingers. "Wait!" he heard a voice cry out. "The fellow by that book! I saw him move." He was pulled from the wreckage, placed on a stretcher, transported on another train to a hospital in Tatanagar. He had broken his pelvis, his right femur, and 3 of his ribs on the right side. For the next year of his life, he lay flat on his back, ordered to keep as still as possible as the bones of his body healed. There was a risk that his right leg might be permanently paralyzed. He was transferred to Calcutta Medical College, where 2 screws were put into his hips. By December, he had returned to his parents' house in Alipore, carried throughout the courtyard and up the red clay stairs like a corpse, hoisted on the shoulders of his 4 brothers. 3 times a day, he was spoon-fed. He urinated and defecated into a tin pan. Doctors and visitors came and went. Even his blind grandfather from Jamshedpur paid a visit. His family had saved the newspaper accounts. In a photograph, he observed the train smashed to shards, piled jaggedly against the sky, security guards sitting on the unclaimed belongings. He learned that fish plates and bowls had been found several feet from the main track, giving rise to the suspicion, never subsequently confirmed, of sabotage. That bodies had been mutilated beyond recognition. Holiday makers tryst with death, the Times of India had written. In the beginning, for most of the day, he had stared at his bedroom ceiling, at the 3 beige blades of the fan churning at its center, their edges grimy. He could hear the top edge of a calendar scraping against the wall behind him when the fan was on. If he moved his neck to the right, he had a view of a window with a dusty bottle of Dettol on its ledge, and, if the shutters were open, the concrete of the wall that surrounded the house, the pale brown geckos that scampered there. He listened to the constant parade of sounds outside: footsteps, bicycle bells, the incessant squawking of crows, and of the horns of rickshaws in the lane so narrow that taxis could not fit. He heard the tube well at the corner being pumped into urns. Every evening at dusk, he heard a conch shell being blown in the house next door to signal the hour for prayer. He could smell, but not see the shimmering green sludge that collected in the open sewer. Life within the house continued. His father came and went from work, his brothers and sisters from school. His mother worked in the kitchen, checking in on him periodically, her lap stained with turmeric. Twice daily the maid twisted rags into buckets of water and wiped the floors. During the day he was groggy from painkillers. At night he dreamed either that he was still trapped inside the train, or, worse, that the accident had never happened, that he was walking down a street, taking a bath, sitting cross-legged on the floor and eating a plate of food. And then he would wake up, coated in sweat, tears streaming down his face, convinced that he would never live to do such things again. Eventually, in an attempt to avoid his nightmares, he began to read late at night, which was when his motionless body felt most restless, his mind agile and clear. Yet he refused to read the Russians his grandfather had brought to his bedside, or any novels for that matter. Those books, set in countries he had never seen, reminded him only of his confinement. Instead, he read his engineering books, trying his best to keep up with his courses, solving equations by flashlight. In those silent hours, he thought often of Ghosh. "Pack a pillow and a blanket," he heard Ghosh say. He remembered the address Ghosh had written on a page of his diary, somewhere behind the tram depot in Tollygung. Now it was the home of a widow, a fatherless son. Each day, to bolster his spirits, his family reminded him of the future, the day he would stand unassisted, walk across the room. It was for this day, each day, that his father and mother prayed. For this, that his mother gave up meat on Wednesdays. But as the months passed, Ashok began to envision another sort of future. He imagined not only walking, but walking away, as far as he could, from the place in which he was born and in which he had nearly died. The following year, with the aid of a cane, he returned to college and graduated, and without telling his parents he applied to college, continuing his engineering studies abroad. Only after he had been accepted with a full fellowship, a newly issued passport in hand, did he inform them of his plans. "But we nearly lost you once," his bewildered father had protested. His siblings had pleaded and wept. His mother, speechless, had refused food for 3 days. In spite of all that, he had gone. 7 years later, there are still certain images that wipe him flat. They lurk around a corner as he rushes through the engineering department at MIT, checks his campus mail. They hover by his shoulder as he leans over a plate of rice at dinner time, or nestles against Ashima's limbs at night. At every turning point in his life, at his wedding when he stood behind Ashima, encircling her waist and peering over her shoulder as they poured puffed rice into a fire, or during his first hours in America, seeing a small grey city caked with snow. He had tried but failed to push these images away. The twisted, battered, capsized bogies of the train, his body twisted below it, the terrible crunching sound he had heard but not comprehended, his bones crushed as fine as flour. It is not the memory of pain that haunts him. He has no memory of that. It is the memory of waiting before he was rescued, and the persistent fear rising up in his throat that he might not have been rescued at all. To this day he is claustrophobic, holding his breath in elevators, feels pent up in cars unless the windows are open on both sides. On planes, he requests the bulkhead seat. At times, the wailing of children fills him with deepest dread. At times, he still presses his ribs to make sure they are solid. He presses them now in the hospital, shaking his head in disbelief. Although it is Ashima who carries the child, he too feels heavy with the thought of life, of his life, and the life about to come from it. He was raised without running water, nearly killed at 22. Again, he tastes the dust on his tongue, sees the twisted train, the giant overturned iron wheels. None of this was supposed to happen. But no, he had survived it. He was born twice in India, and then a third time in America. 3 lives by 30. For this he thanks his parents, and their parents, and the parents of their parents. He does not thank God. He openly reveres Marx and quietly refuses religion. But there is one more dead soul he has to thank. He cannot thank the book. The book had perished, as he nearly did, in scattered pieces in the earliest hours of an October day in a field 209 kilometers from Calcutta. Instead of thanking God, he thanks Gogol, the Russian writer who had saved his life. When Patty enters the waiting room.